Hello there, I'm Kat, and it's this channel's 6th year anniversary. Well, 6th year since I returned, because I stopped making videos for about 2 years. Why is this even recording? It's supposed to be a montage right now that's playing. Can we just cut to the montage? That's right, 6 years to this day, this channel has been up and running. Albeit not as frequently as I planned it to be, but we'll ignore that for the festivities. 6 years of highlighting unappreciated titles and gushing about Fire Emblem. In fact, for the occasion, I originally planned to review the spin-off Fire Emblem Warriors. You know, tie it into how this humble channel has grown over the years, much like how the series has risen in prominence after nearly going the way of now dormant Nintendo series like Advance Wars and Wario Land. That is, until I played it. That's a story for another time, needless to say, it did not impress. Also, I prefer that these anniversary reviews be positive, even more so this year given that 2018 started off on a particularly poor note. So, that being the case, I decided, what with us being in the middle of the Persona Western retrospective, to expand on one of the points mentioned in part 1. Namely, how JRPGs didn't connect with Western audiences. Upon reflection, the brevity and detail in this scenario may have given people the impression that there was little, if any, attempt to court Western audiences' interest in this new genre. Historically speaking, that's not true. It wasn't as if it was an effortless affair on the part of the developers or publishers behind these games. When Square released the first Final Fantasy in North America, they included an intricately detailed handbook to help players get acquainted with the more methodical genre of gaming, and Enix famously partnered with Nintendo to release the first Dragon Quest, then localized under the moniker Dragon Warrior, giving subscribers of the magazine, Nintendo Power, a free copy along with a lengthy walkthrough of the game. Nintendo went so far as to take up the localization effort of the first Dragon Quest, giving the game a charming full Elizabethan dialect. Yet, only a few years later, Enix saw their North American offices close up shop after each successive NES Dragon Quest suffered from decreasing sales. And of course, no retrospective of pre-Final Fantasy JRPG failures would be complete without mentioning Nintendo's nonsensical marketing of Earthbound and the game's subsequent commercial failure. That's not to say that there weren't critically acclaimed JRPGs. While the years following Final Fantasy VII are considered a golden age for the genre, there was no shortage of standard releases on the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, like Secret of Mana and Phantasy Star 4. However, a fair amount of these titles never did receive their dues at the time, lingering in obscurity as a result of poor sales, or in some cases, no sales because they never saw a North American release. One of those games was Terranigma. Released in Japan on October 20th, 1995, Terranigma makes for a unique case in the pantheon of 90s JRPGs. Whereas the likes of Seiken Densetsu 3 and Final Fantasy V were left for fans to translate, Terranigma was fully translated into English and released in Europe and even Australia by Nintendo, with additional translations made for French and German languages. It was never released in North America, though the reason why has never been particularly clear. Some speculate that this was due to the prominence of religious imagery throughout the game. This claim has always been built on a weak foundation. Nintendo of America, while still not the most tolerable of companies at the time, have become laxer with allowing games on their systems to use religious imagery and feature graphic content, certainly more so than they were during the highly restrictive NES days, where they forced developers to remove content like a hamster in a microwave. In fact, religion features prominently in ActRaiser, and that was one of the first games to ever hit the Super Nintendo. It's more likely that, due to Enix's North American offices having closed at the time, there was no viable way for them to get the game they published in Japan released in North America. As for why Nintendo didn't release it, there are two major events to remember. One is the aforementioned failure of Earthbound. The other is that the Nintendo 64 was released in North America during the latter half of 1996. With Terranigma being released so late in the Super Famicom's life cycle and the N64 on the horizon, it's likely that Nintendo made the decision not to print the game in North America and instead focus on their upcoming console's release in that region. It's not unprecedented considering that a similar reason was given for cancelling a completed game that went by the name of Star Fox 2. Earthbound falling with such a profound thud likely helped to inform that decision. Also, I think people seem to forget this, but Nintendo tends to have a wary relationship with releasing games in North America that happen to be JRPGs. While Terranigma was released in Europe in December of 1996, months after the North American release of the N64, that region didn't get the console until March of 1997, so it made some sense for the PAL region to have received it, and North America to have missed out on it. Also, Australia kinda gets screwed over when it comes to video games, so hey, let them have this one. The game was developed by Quintet. If that name sounds familiar, it's because they were the developers behind the aforementioned ActRaiser. And ActRaiser 2, but everybody makes mistakes. Quintet was among the most unique developers for the system. Keyword being was, we'll get to that later. Terranigma is often considered the finale to the Soul trilogy that Quintet began with Soul Blazer. So, did this trilogy end with a bang? Let's find out. Terranigma opens with our protagonist, Ark, a jovial denizen living in the last village that exists in this frozen wasteland that is this world, awakening from his bed. After being goaded into opening up a blue door, whose passage has been forbidden by the town's elder, he discovers a stairway that leads to a strange box in an underground dungeon. Upon opening it, the town's inhabitants freeze, and a strange being called Yomi comes out. With no one else to help him, Ark turns to the elder, who tells him that only by resurrecting the continent will the town of Crystal return to normal. Thus, Ark sets off on a journey to save his hometown and resurrect a ravaged world. Without getting into heavy spoilers, the story is, in a word, unique. While it borrows ideas from earlier Quintet games, such as the constant struggle between light and dark, and the reliance of a major figure with heavy Christian symbolism, resurrecting a world that's in a currently undesirable state, his name is Ark after all, there isn't anything quite like it on the Super Nintendo or indeed any system on the market when it comes to execution. It's also remarkably well localized for the time. You'll find no spooky bards among its script. What one can find is a slew of powerful moments and rich symbolism that are difficult to do justice without spoiling them, and equally hard to justify spoiling given how enthralling it is to experience these moments by oneself. It's a deep story that quietly reflects on the nature of humanity. It damns us for our cruelty and selfishness, yet champions our intelligence and all the good that's been accomplished in our short existence. We see this with how rapidly civilization grows in a mere trio of years following Ark's actions in resurrecting the world, with technology, medicine, and theology advancing at an astonishing rate. It makes for a wonderful parallel to the real world that's especially effective in a year that, thus far, has been less than inspired, albeit with some truly standout moments. Which is why it's simultaneously problematic and confusing as to why they included Columbus in such a prominent role in the game and depicted in such a positive light at that. No, not that Columbus. Yes, clearly it was this Columbus I was talking about. While Terranigma isn't the only piece of media to be guilty of the historical revisionism of Christopher, it nevertheless sours the story about the reconciling of humanity's flawed nature when it features a being whose real-life counterpart is beyond flawed, spreading his genius exploration ideas to this game's European continent. It's not a deal-breaker by any means, but it does come across as surprisingly thoughtless in a game with so much thought put into its ideas and characters. Speaking of characters, Ark is among the most refreshing leads one can find in a JRPG, a troublemaker who goes through an arc, I'm so sorry, and grows alongside the world he's attempting to salvage, bringing himself and the world into a more enlightened era. Though the cast that accompanies him is small for the genre, it's a matter of quality over quantity. They're made memorable and interesting thanks to strong writing and lively animation. It all comes together for a thoughtful tale that truly trounces the test of time. That said, it's not the only area where Terranigma is praiseworthy for its inventive ideas. Much like a story, Terranigma's gameplay stands out among its contemporaries with its mixture of unique ideas and impeccable execution. While most Japanese RPGs released in the 90s would use turn-based systems for their combat, Terranigma embraced a real-time action system, and a fairly robust one for the time. In addition to a standard attack, Ark can pull off a rush, jump, running, and running jump attack that adds this wonderful fluidity to combat. While it's not particularly complex by modern standard, it is thoroughly engaging thanks to a consistent stream of enemies throughout dungeons that can only be damaged by certain attacks, and other foes that require more thoughtful strategy, which keeps every encounter interesting. Keeping with this theme of forward thinking, there's not a single random battle to be found in the entire game. Every enemy is visible on the screen and can either be fought or avoided. It's practically unheard of for the time and a welcome respite from the usual onslaught of busy work that comes with high encounter rates and your average JRPG. Likewise, the inventory neatly lays out the various items, armors, and weapons in a manner that's both visually distinct from its counterparts and helpful when searching for the latest addition to your arsenal. The dungeons are equal part elaborate, with a plethora of puzzles placed throughout, and varied with the different scenarios there are to find. One area might have you sneak past guards, while the other might have you escort a lion climb across the canyon. They're similar in design to Quintet's previous release, Illusion of Gaia, albeit Terranigma makes much greater use of its new tools more so than anything Gaia ever had, namely with the aforementioned ability to jump, and equipment you'll unlock a la Zelda that further expands on how one can explore a given dungeon. What's more, Terranigma manages to mix in its story with the exploration of the world and the dungeons that occupy it. Early on, you will restore the lush greens to the surface area, after which a newer area will be opened up to you via a newly grown vine. It's a small detail, but one that helps to emphasize the impact that Ark's actions are having on the world. On that note, Terranigma features some truly wonderful world building with its side quests. Again, to avoid heavy spoilers, I'm only going to talk about one of them, and you can skip to here if you want to avoid it entirely. 3, 2, 1. In the midpoint of the game, you'll find nomadic people living near the Gobi Desert, including a little girl who remains silent when you talk to her. Later on, you'll be able to buy some flowers and give one to the silent girl who tells you that her name is Chia. So this little girl, turns out that she was separated from her parents a while ago, and they've been heartbroken about it ever since, something you'll discover when you find his parents in China. I did mention this game takes place on Earth, right? Like, Earth, as in the planet you're watching this video from? Or at least, I hope you're watching it from this planet. Or they have astronauts watching this video in space, you know, that'd be neat. After ARK released the news of their daughter being alive and living with the nomads, it fills them with so much joy that they travel across the continents just so they can bring her back home. Heartwarming side quests like these are plentiful in Terranigma, making it an absolute joy to explore. The game has a slow start, but once it gets going, there's not much to complain about. There's the occasional moment of frustration, but as for notable flaws with the game, only two come to mind. The basics of the magic system aren't well explained. You can purchase pins in towns that allow you to cast various spells. You can only carry as many spells as you have magic rocks, with different spells using a different number of magic rocks to hold them, and said number increasing with each new magic rock you find. Think of them as your magic points and the storage where to refill your MP, with more spells becoming available for purchase as you progress through the story. These spells work in conjunction with an elemental system that makes certain attacks stronger or weaker against certain enemies, which provides further incentive for experimenting with different attacks and types of spells to see which is most effective on what enemy. And that brings us to the other problem. Bloody Mary's bloody massive difficulty spike. Up to this point in the game, Terranigma has been fairly intelligent with its handling of challenge. In the beginning, ARK's health will slowly regenerate as you explore the quadruple of towers, which is really helpful for letting players familiarize themselves with the game's combat and magic system. It's a training wheel, one you lose after completing the first 5 towers and returning to the surface. From there, the difficulty moves upward, albeit on a steady curve that never feels like the game is lobbing an unfair challenge at you. And then Bloody Mary happens. This is the most difficult boss in the entire game. Your attacks do virtually no damage, whereas she'll take a quarter off of your health with each attack. And it should be mentioned that there's few invincibility frames for you to recover, so getting hit once by the gems that surround her can quickly turn into a death sentence. The only way to defeat her is to load up on as many electrical spells and heal items as you can carry in a nearby town and spam every spell you currently hold, just hoping it's enough to take her down. It's especially egregious considering previous and future bosses managed to provide a mixture of variety and challenge with their intricate attack patterns. Still, if you're going to overlook this ludicrous leap in difficulty, you'll find a beautiful game that's well worth investing the 15 or so hours it takes to beat, especially when you just get the gut punch of an ending. It's so good. When I say Terranigma is a beautiful game, I'm not just referring to its storytelling or gameplay. The sprite work is incredible. It features some of the finest use of Mode 7 on the Super Nintendo, with breathtakingly beautiful backgrounds. Characters feature lively animations that are full of personality, and the various foregrounds blend well with the aforementioned backs. And then there's the soundtrack. Oh my, is there the soundtrack. Miyoko Kobayashi and Masanori Hikichi's contributions comprise a collection of mesmerizing melodies. Even the game over jingle is enrapturing. To simply say these tracks are terrific is an understatement. Much like the rest of the game, they are simply unforgettable. Terranigma is a masterpiece. Full stop. If it isn't the best SNES JRPG, its only competition is, Final Fantasy VI. I'd rank it above Chrono Trigger any day. That said, before you rush to eBay and pick up a copy, there's one major caveat you should know. The price. As fantastic a game as this is, and as worthwhile a journey as this one may be, it's hard to justify spending upwards of $100 on any game. It might not be Shantae levels of expensive, but at least Shantae was released on the Virtual Console. One of the reasons why I've chosen the titles that I have for these yearly celebrations is to highlight titles whose quality may have been overlooked by the general public, but are nevertheless reasonably easy to find and affordable to boot, thus making them easy to recommend given the low barrier of entry. Except for the time I reviewed a Turnip Blade, but I digress. It's unclear as to why Enix, now Square Enix, has yet to put Terranigma on any digital storefront. After all, they did release other Quintet games on the Virtual Console like ActRaiser, and much like Nintendo's Sin and Punishment, Terranigma is already translated to English. In any case, I can't recommend you pick up a copy through conventional means. Now let's be clear, if Square does release it on the Virtual Console, Xbox Live, or PSN, or more likely gives it a hideous remake, that'll be your best option, but for now, unless you can afford $100 for a physical copy, and potentially risk that copy being in German, your best bet is through emulation, if only to expose yourself to the work of a studio that history has not been particularly kind towards. After Terranigma, Quintet never made a game with the level of ambition or thematic richness of its magnum opus, and to put it mildly, their output dried up. There's not much information as to what happened, but after they co-developed a PlayStation game called Planet Laika, they essentially stopped making major video games, their only other work of note being assistant with minor releases. In fact, their website has been offline since 2008. Nobody seems to know if they're still around, or for that matter, what they're doing. It's a sad and quiet end to such a profoundly unique developer, one who was able to create this enriching experience among many others. So, here's to you, Quintet. Well, this was a, bit of a downer ending. In any case, I do want to thank you all for joining me in this yearly celebration. As for what's in store for the channel over the next 12 months, we'll be continuing the Persona Western retrospective, we'll tackle the 4-year history of the Smudge Sea, assuming it releases at least, and of course, we'll see what the Fire Emblem series has in store for us when it comes to the Nintendo Switch. But, until next time, as always, game on, my friends.